For a little while, picture yourself as a Persian soldier around 480 BC. You are a member of the biggest army in history. Under the leadership of the great King Xerxes, hundreds of thousands of troops marched. You have conquered strong cities and traversed whole countries. And you are now traveling to southern Greece, where there is a small rocky peninsula. At a location known as Thermopylae, your leaders inform you that you will only be up against a few thousand dissident Greeks. Shouldn't it be simple? Then you hear rumors circulating among the soldiers, tales of fighters that never back down, regarding men who would sooner die than give up, about troops that were groomed for battle from birth. The Spartans are these people. We shall learn today why confronting them was the worst nightmare of any ancient army. We need to start at the beginning in order to fully comprehend the fear that the Spartans instilled in their adversaries. The Greek city-state of Sparta was not like the others. Every element of civilization was focused towards producing the most skilled fighters the ancient world had ever seen, making it a painstakingly planned war machine. It took time for this change to occur. Centuries of social and military development, influenced by regional demands, political forces, and a distinct warrior mentality, led to its creation. The history of Sparta starts in the dry mountains of the Peloponnese, an area that, unlike other regions of Greece, did not value intensive cultivation. Around the 11th century BC, the first Spartans, referred to as Dorians, came to this area. Sparta was bordered by harsh terrain and adversarial neighbors, which compelled the Spartans to make a crucial decision. This was in contrast to other Greek city-states that thrived through maritime trade and diplomacy. They could make an attempt to economically compete with Corinth and Athens, or they could turn all their citizens into professional warriors, a specialty no other Greek city-state dared try. Their choice altered not only Sparta's destiny, but also the path of Western history as a whole. The Great Rhetra was a novel social structure that the Spartans adopted in the 8th century BC. This was more than a collection of laws. It was a complete restructuring of society with the sole objective of building the most effective military apparatus the world had ever seen. Under this arrangement, the whole population was split into 3 distinct classes. By birth, the Spartiades were citizen warriors. Trade and crafts were the responsibility of the Periuki, who were free men but not citizens, as well as the Helots, who were basically serfs bound to the land and who provided the agricultural work necessary to keep society going. Something never before possible in human history was made possible by this social framework. A class of warriors who are entirely focused on the art of combat and are not required to work for a living. Whereas other Greek soldiers were farmers, merchants, or craftsmen who took up arms when called upon. But the Spartans were professional soldiers from the time they could wield a spear. But the ability to fully commit to combat was not the only thing that set the Spartans apart. It's how they chose to do it. There was nothing like the agoge, the Spartan educational system, in antiquity.
Instead of a school in the modern sense, it was a decades-long program of psychological and military training that shaped a man's identity as well as his battle abilities. Even before a Spartan child was born, this system was in place. A Spartan lady was not merely carrying a child when she became pregnant. She was courting a potential state soldier. In Sparta, the birth of a child signaled the beginning of a harsh selection process that would determine whether or not they were worthy to be a Spartan warrior. The infant was placed in the care of seasoned elders who closely examined it right after birth rather than in the mother's tender embrace. They looked for signs of physical vitality, health, and strength. A child was considered unworthy to serve the Spartan state if they displayed any signs of frailty, deformity, or disease.
These children's fate was decided in an instant. They were brought to Mount Tigatos's passes and abandoned to perish. For the Spartans, this procedure was a practical need, even though it may seem harsh by today's standards. The cost of feeding and training men who would not be able to fight successfully was beyond Sparta's means. In order to produce soldiers capable of defending the city-state against adversaries who frequently outnumbered them, every resource, training session, and grain of food had to be used. Only the most physically fit would have the opportunity to become complete Spartans. Childhood selection was only the first filtration. For the infants who passed the first examination, the first few years of life were a time of meticulous preparation. In contrast to moms in other regions of Greece, Spartan moms were encouraged to be robust and physically active. They believed that children of powerful moms would also be strong. Spartan women kept up a high-protein diet, engaged in physical activity, and competed in sports. They were regarded as vital collaborators in the development of the next generation of warriors, rather than being restricted to their houses as in other Greek cities. The real change started when she was 7 years old. At this point, Spartan boys were taken from their homes and turned over to the government to start the agoge. Picture the scene. Herded into groups, hundreds of 7-year-olds, some still wailing for their mothers, were marched to military camps where they would reside for the next 13 years. There was no going back. No weekend trips home were a non-existent. There were no vacations or holidays. These children were Spartan from that day on. Each phase of the agoge intended to foster a particular quality of a Spartan warrior. Building fundamental physical and mental endurance was the main goal of the first phase, which lasted from ages 7 to 12. Youngsters were taught to tolerate pain, exhaustion, hunger, and cold. Even during the bitterly cold Peloponnese winter, they slept on the hard ground with only a flimsy cloak. Food was purposefully limited. Not so little that the kids starved to death, but enough that they were hungry all the time and had to fight to get more food. There were several reasons why this deliberate food shortage was used in Spartan training. In the first place, it taught kids how to work efficiently even when their basic needs weren't entirely satisfied, which is an important skill for soldiers who could have to march for days on meager supplies. Secondly, it inspired them to be inventive and creative. Spartan children were expected to steal extra food to augment their meals. There was a catch, though. They suffered harsh punishments if they were found to be stealing, for being incompetent enough to be caught, rather than for the act of stealing itself, which was regarded as a valuable soldierly skill. This seemingly incongruous punishment scheme exemplifies a key aspect of Spartan education. It taught the kind of tactical and psychological thinking required for battle, in addition to physical skills. A Spartan soldier had to be able to survive off the land, sneak into enemy territory, and use all methods necessary to get resources without being seen. Kids who were able to steal food without getting caught were displaying the kind of practical intelligence that might be useful in combat. As the agoge children's training got increasingly more focused and rigorous, they moved into the second phase of the curriculum, which focused on more direct combat skills. When they were 12 years old, they started learning the weapons that will define their life. The short sword, known as the xiphos, the round shield, known as the aspis, and the long spear, known as the dori. More important than mastering any one weapon was learning to fight as a cohesive team. The Spartan phalanx formation was the core of Spartan military strategy, requiring years of practice to master. A Spartan phalanx was not just a collection of warriors in close combat. Each fighter was a solitary being, like a cell within a larger body.
Each soldier needed to be able to coordinate his moves with the troops behind, in front of, and beside him, in addition to knowing how to utilize his own weapons efficiently. Dozens of fellow soldiers could be killed if the formation were to be broken by a single error, a lapse of judgment, or a lack of coordination. Young Spartans spend hours each day practicing military exercises to teach them this synchronization. They gained the ability to move as a team, maintain their places even in the face of tremendous pressure, and immediately and unquestioningly obey orders. Most significantly, though, they came to fully trust the men who accompanied them. Your life literally hinged on the bravery and ability of the warriors surrounding you in a phalanx. You would be vulnerable to enemy strikes if the man next to you broke formation or lowered his shield. Because of their mutual reliance, Spartan warriors developed relationships that went well beyond basic military camaraderie. The Spartan concept recognized the need for more than simply tactical and physical training to produce competent warriors. To confront the atrocities of ancient battle, they had to cultivate the mental and emotional fortitude required. Ancient combat was not as impersonal and remote as contemporary conflict can be. At close range, it was devastating. Warriors battled so close to their opponents that they could hear their agonized cries, feel their breath, and see the fear or resolve in their eyes. It took a unique kind of mental toughness to survive and prevail in this kind of battle. The agoge put young Spartans through a battery of tests and rites intended to erode any psychological flaws and rehabilitate their brains as weapons of war in order to cultivate this toughness. Diamastegosis, a cruel practice in which young Spartans were publicly whipped until they bled, was one of the most well-known of these exams. Teaching future warriors to withstand severe pain without breaking or displaying symptoms of weakness was the aim, not sadism. Hundreds of Spartans gathered to see the tying of young men to an altar and their whipping with an iron rod. In addition to the physical discomfort, the thought that everyone in the neighborhood was waiting to see if you would break added to the tremendous psychological pressure. People were deemed unworthy to become full warriors if they shouted, pleaded for forgiveness, or passed out. The designation of Spartan was only given to those who silently suffered the torment, frequently to the point of death. Despite its seemingly extremeness, this kind of conditioning had a very precise military function. Soldiers frequently encountered situations in the heat of combat where suffering, terror, and mayhem could paralyze or shatter them. A Spartan warrior who had been conditioned from an early age to bear excruciating pain and remain composed under pressure had a considerable psychological edge over adversaries who had not. A wounded Spartan soldier fought in deathly stillness, while a wounded Persian soldier yelled in agony and fear. The agoge placed a strong emphasis on developing what we now refer to as emotional intelligence and leadership, in addition to physical and psychological conditioning. Young Spartans gained the ability to read and affect other people's emotions, in addition to controlling their own. They learned how to frighten adversaries, instill confidence in their fellow soldiers, and keep a unit's spirits high even under the most trying conditions. Learning to deal with death was an essential component of this emotional education. The potential for their own demise, as well as the fact that close friends and family members have died. From an early age, young Spartans were exposed to death. They took part in ritual hunts when they were supposed to murder both humans and animals, witnessed classmates die during especially harsh training, and witnessed the public execution of disobedient helots. The goal of this constant mortality exposure was to make them less sensitive to the psychological damage that could render them immobile during conflict.
But the Spartan system's approach to motivation was arguably its most psychologically advanced feature. The Spartans knew that when troops have a cause they are passionate about, they will battle to the end. They developed a set of social identities and values to generate this drive, making being a Spartan warrior the very essence of human value in society, rather than merely a career. Young men in the ago were indoctrinated from an early age that the value of their life depended on how well they performed their military duties. They were often told tales of cowards who had been shunned by society for displaying fear, and of Spartan heroes who had died valiantly in combat. They discovered that dying in battle was the most honorable end a man could experience, not something to be feared. In addition to offering encouragement, the well-known advice given by Spartan mothers to their sons leaving for battle, "Return with your shield or on it," made it abundantly evident that cowardice was worse than death. This psychological conditioning produced warriors who were literally incapable of surrendering or retreating. Breaking into combat wasn't merely a tactical blunder for a Spartan who had received proper training. Everything he had been taught to appreciate in himself was fundamentally denied. This explains why the Spartans were so successful in circumstances that seemed insurmountable. The Spartans just did not have that psychological option, but other warriors would weigh the chances and conclude that a strategic withdrawal was prudent. After 13 years in the ago, the young Spartans were finally put to the test at the age of 20, which would decide whether they would be granted full citizenship as soldiers or be reduced to a lower rank for the remainder of their lives. This test was neither a written examination nor a controlled skill demonstration. It was an actual mission in which the young guys were put into the field by themselves with the directive to use only their cunning and talents to live for a predetermined amount of time. Young Spartans were supposed to live off the land, evade detection, and then frequently carry out particular tasks like killing helots who were deemed dangerous or possible insurrection leaders during this final ordeal known as the Krypteia. This was more than just a survival exercise. Their readiness to go to all lengths to defend the Spartan state was likewise put to the test. Those who passed the Krypteia were deemed complete Spartans, Spariites, and granted the privilege to carry guns as citizen soldiers, regardless of how ethically dubious it may have been. However, their military training was incomplete even at that time. They had more rigorous military training throughout their 20s and 30s, with an emphasis on leadership, sophisticated tactics, and specialization in many facets of combat. A Spartan was only deemed mature enough to get married and start a family at the age of 30, and they still prioritized their military duties above all else. The soldiers that emerged from this decades-long educational system were unlike any other in the ancient world. Adult Spartans received more than just military training. There was no other setting in which he could function psychologically. They had never been exposed to farming, trading, or crafting. Therefore, they had no idea how to do these things. They had been taught that any failure short of complete victory was unacceptable, so they had no idea how to compromise or negotiate. They were human war machines in the most literal sense. But the Spartan army's strength came from more than just producing individual super soldiers. Their ability to operate as a cohesive combat force was what really distinguished them from other ancient armies. Centuries of military development, honed by real battle experience against a variety of adversaries, reflected Spartan organization and tactics. The Anamtia, which consisted of about 35 soldiers, was the basic Spartan military unit. This division was more than merely administrative. The family was in the military, and Anamantia's members lived, fed, trained, and battled together from one another.
They were well aware of each other's advantages and disadvantages. They were aware of each comrade's response to various forms of pressure. A certain amount of tactical coordination was made possible by this close familiarity. With soldiers who did not know one another well, such was not conceivable. A Pentecostus of about 140 men was organized by many Anamothi, while a locus of around 560 soldiers was formed by several Pentecostists. The Mora, a group of around 2,240 men led by a Pole Marcos, was at the summit of the hierarchy. Significant tactical flexibility was made possible by this organizational structure. Although commanders could quickly rearrange their forces for various combat scenarios without sacrificing effectiveness or cohesion, Spartan superiority was not explained solely by organization. Their usage of the phalanx formation was what really made them devastating. The phalanx was not invented by the Spartans. It was also used by other Greek city-states. However, it was polished and perfected by the Spartans, who turned it from a simple military strategy into a weapon of battle that was almost unbeatable. 8 ranks of men, each with a circular bronze shield about a meter in diameter and a spear around 2.5 meters long, made up a typical Spartan phalanx.
The shield was more than just protective gear. It played a crucial role in Spartan offensive strategies. Every soldier used his left arm to hold his shield such that it shielded both his own left side and the man next to him's right side. This overlapping shield formed a wall of bronze that was almost impenetrable and capable of absorbing sword, spear, and arrow strikes. Complete discipline and coordination were essential to the success of this formation. A Spartan phalanx moved as a single organism when it progressed. While the soldiers in the rear ranks held their spears at angles that permitted them to protrude past the front rank, the troops in the front rank kept their spears pointed forward. In front of the formation, this produced a wall of spearheads that stretched for several meters. Being confronted with advancing Spartan phalanx had a catastrophic psychological effect. Imagine yourself in the enemy army, watching hundreds of golden warriors march in unison toward you. The sound of their sandals marching in unison, the spears clanging rhythmically against their shields, the sun-glinting shields, the deadly forest of bronze tips formed by their spears, and the war chants they chanted, created an intimidating cacophony that could demoralize the enemy before the battle even started. However, Spartan tactics truly excelled, not just in the defensive formation, it was in their offensive use of it. The conflict turned into a physical shoving match as soon as the phalanx touched the opposing lines. The front ranks were forced into the enemy lines by the intense pressure created by the Spartans at the rear of the formation, pushing the troops in front of them with their shields. This strategy, called othismos, or pushing, reduced the conflict to a straight-up struggle for strength, stamina, and willpower. The soldiers in the front of the formation had to try to puncture the enemy with their own weapons while holding their places, while being stabbed by hostile spears. While their frontline friends were being killed and injured, those behind had to keep up steady advance pressure. When it came to this kind of fighting, the Spartans had the upper hand. They were stronger than regular soldiers because of their years of physical training. Even though men were dying all around them, they were able to remain disciplined and coordinated thanks to their psychological training. Most importantly, they were always ready to die rather than back down, which was essential in a strategy that relied on moving forward steadily. Pressure. Additionally, Spartan equipment was better than that of most ancient armies. Their shields were manufactured by expert artisans who dedicated their lives to honing the craft of making military gear out of the best bronze available. For optimal performance in close combat, their spears were balanced and constructed from carefully selected wood.
Their armor was made especially to allow for maximum mobility without compromising essential protection, even if it was lighter than that of some armies. However, the standardization of Spartan equipment was arguably its most inventive feature. Every Spartan soldier wore nearly the same gear, in contrast to other ancient armies that frequently had soldiers wearing a range of weaponry and armor based on their regional background or personal wealth. There was more to this uniformity than appearance. It had significant tactical ramifications. In terms of movement speed, shield protection, and weapon range, it meant that every soldier was fully aware of what to anticipate from his fellow soldiers. Additionally, Spartan logistics were better than those of the majority of ancient armies. The Spartans had devised methods to keep their troops in the field for long stretches of time with few supplies, whereas many armies depended on intricate supply lines or survived on territory they had acquired. Their troops received training on how to survive on smaller rations, locate water in hazardous areas, and keep their weapons in combat condition even after weeks of fighting. The Spartans had a major strategic edge because of their better logistics. They could launch military operations into areas where other armies couldn't function well. Without worrying about weak supply lines, they could hold sieges for longer stretches of time and, more importantly, react quickly to threats in different areas of their domain. All of these Spartan advantages combined to make it possible for relatively small Spartan forces to compete against much larger armies with a realistic prospect of winning by the time we reach the Greco-Persian Wars in the early 5th century BC. The Spartan military system had been built to meet the type of challenge posed by the Persian Empire. A formidable foe with far more resources, one that depended more on sheer numbers than on the quality of each soldier. The size of the Persian army that invaded Greece in 480 BC was astounding. Persian troops were described in ancient records as having hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of men, though these numbers may have been overstated. Even if we lower these figures to more reasonable estimates, we still have an army that was at least 10 times larger than any force the Greeks could assemble, if not larger. However, the Persians had other advantages than size. The Persian Empire possessed enormous financial resources that enabled it to hire military professionals from all over the known globe, maintain sophisticated logistics systems, and provide their warriors with high-quality weaponry and armor. Along with indigenous Persian warriors, the Persian army also included Massagetites, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and hundreds of other ethnic groups, each of whom contributed unique military skills. The Persians also enjoyed significant technological advantages. Their archers, who could shoot clouds of arrows that could darken the sky, were regarded as some of the best in the ancient world. With shock charges, their strong cavalry could breach infantry ranks. They had siege warfare-trained engineers who could create devices that could break through the defenses of even the most fortified towns. The Persians, perhaps above all, had experience. After decades of victorious military conquests, the Persian Empire had conquered lands from India to the Black Sea. Its generals had encountered every kind of enemy and strategy. They were able to adapt their tactics to fit different environments and circumstances. They had every reason to think this would be another ordinary conquest. When they marched into Greece, Greek resistance appeared almost ridiculous to the Persians. Compared to the Persians, the Greek city-states were tiny, frequently engaged in internal strife, and possessed microscopic armed forces. It may have appeared as if the resistance would be overrun in a matter of hours when Persian spies reported that the Greek defenders at Thermopylae Pass were down to a few thousand Greeks and a few hundred Spartans. However, what the Persians were marching against was not entirely clear to them.
They had previously encountered Greek warriors. They had never seen Spartans fighting on their own soil, protecting their homes and family on terrain that suited their particular tactics. Even though Greek mercenaries had served in Persian armies and certain Greek city-states in Asia Minor had been overrun during earlier Persian incursions, the Greek defenders selected the Thermopylae Pass specifically because it negated several of the Persian advantages. The Persian army's numerical advantage was eliminated since it was so narrow that only a tiny percentage of them could strike at once. Cavalry charges were not feasible due to the rough terrain. The Greek position was difficult for Persian archers to flank due to the sheer walls on both sides of the pass. More significantly, the terrain compelled a conflict that the Spartans were well prepared for: close-quarters infantry warfare, where numbers were less important than discipline, training, and willpower. Thermopylae reduced all Persian numerical and technological advantages to a straightforward test of who could maintain a superior battle line in close quarters. The Persians soon realized they were up against a different kind of soldier than they had ever seen before the war started. The Immortals, a group of elite soldiers, were the first to assault. Persian troops were regarded as the finest available in the empire. All around the known world, these guys had vanquished armies and taken over cities. When the elite Persian soldiers confronted the few Greeks in the past, they anticipated that they would shatter and run. Rather, they were confronted by an iron and bronze barricade that would not move, with their spears forming a lethal forest that impaled anybody who came too close. The Spartans faced the Persian charge in perfect formation. The Immortals attempted to flank the Spartan position using their increased mobility, but the terrain prevented them from doing so. They found that Greek shields could absorb arrows forever when they attempted to use archers to breach the Spartan formation from a distance. The Spartans' mental response to battle was more unsettling to the Persians. Because of the intense savagery of ancient warfare, Persian warriors were used to enemy who cried, displayed terror, or at least displayed some typical emotional response. Even while men died all around them, the Spartans fought in deathly quiet, their faces concealed by bronze helmets, and mechanically obeyed their superiors' orders. Not only was this quiet frightening, but it was also extremely upsetting psychologically. Fighting Spartans was like fighting ghosts or devils, according to Persian troops who had seen numerous fights. The psychological gratification of witnessing the enemy's dread was non-existent. There were no cries of agony to verify that their assaults were doing harm. There were no indications that the Spartans were regular people who could eventually crack under enough strain. The Persian commanders realized they were dealing with a tactical problem as the first day of the war at Thermopylae went on. Their typical strategies, which included flanking with cavalry, utilizing archers to disrupt enemy formations, or just overwhelming the opponent with superior numbers, were not functioning as planned. Their cavalry was rendered inoperable by the tight defile. Their archers were unable to breach the Spartan shield wall, and the terrain's limitations meant that only a small number of men could engage in combat at once, so it did not help to toss more into the fray. Even worse, the Spartans seemed to be largely unaffected, while the Persians were suffering heavy losses. Dozens of dead were strewn in front of the Spartan line with each wave of the Persian attack, but the Greek formation held firm and appeared to be unstoppable. This encounter was extremely disheartening for Persian warriors used to swift and largely bloodless triumphs over frightened adversaries. The tactical prowess of the Spartans at Thermopylae demonstrated why dealing with these warriors was the bane of every ancient military leader. It was more than just their military prowess. Many ancient armies had troops with skill. They had more than simply adequate equipment. The Persians also possessed high-quality tools. The Spartans were exceptional because of their exceptional technical training, intense psychological conditioning, and social structure, which rendered them practically incapable of thinking about losing. Xerxes may have started to understand that he had seriously overestimated his opponents when he saw the combat from a higher vantage point and witnessed his finest soldiers being repeatedly driven back by a considerably smaller number of Greeks. According to historical accounts, he first thought the Greek resistance would only last a few hours. Instead, it became evident that this war would be radically different from what everyone had expected as the first day wore on into the night, without any notable Persian progress. The Persian forces must have reflected solemnly on the night following the first day of combat at Thermopylae. To subdue a few thousand dissident Greeks, they had brought the biggest force the world had ever seen. Nevertheless, they had not made even a few meters progress. The Greek defenders appeared to be just as powerful as when the conflict began, but their losses were increasing. This was a very unnerving experience for soldiers used to simple conquest. However, the Persian issues extended beyond straightforward strategic problems. Wider strategic ramifications were starting to emerge from the inability to swiftly overcome Greek resistance. The Persian military system's capacity to maintain massive armies in the field through excellent logistics was one of its greatest advantages. But without major advancements, even the Persian logistics system could not support hundreds of thousands of warriors indefinitely. Their supplies ran out, their lines of communication became longer, and their soldiers lost faith in their leaders with each day that went by without a victory. Even worse, the ancient world was hearing about the standoff at Thermopylae. Greek city-states that had contemplated surrendering to the Persian onslaught were now re-evaluating their stances. The subjects of the Persian Empire, who had come to view Persian authority as inevitable, were starting to question if their conquerors were really as unbeatable as they appeared to be. The aura of invincibility, a vital instrument of Persian power, was being undermined by the slowness with which Spartan resistance was being crushed. Xerxes experimented with different strategies on the second day of the conflict. From different regions of his kingdom, he dispatched specialized armies, each equipped with unique weapons and fighting strategies. Fleet warriors from various satrapies who had demonstrated their value in prior battles, Median heavy infantry with their scale armor, and Scythian archers with their formidable composite bows. However, the outcome remained the same. While the Greek line held firm, every force that attempted to attack the Spartan position was repulsed with significant fatalities. The Persians were not entirely aware that they were up against not only better troops, but a whole military apparatus that had been developed specifically for such circumstances. The Spartans weren't merely making up defensive strategies on the fly. They were implementing tactics that had been refined and honed over many centuries. From the time of troop rotations to the distance between soldiers, every element of their organization had been planned for optimal performance in extended warfare. The rotation of Spartan troops was especially advanced. The Spartans had established procedures for bringing new soldiers to the front of the formation and relocating worn-out warriors to the rear, all without compromising the integrity of their combat line. In contrast to other armies that often retained the same men in the front line until they were exhausted or killed, they had a significant advantage in prolonged battles. They also had better close combat skills. Each Spartan had learned how to fight in tight synchronization with their fellow fighters, in addition to how to use their weapons successfully via decades of training.
They were able to coordinate spear blows to pierce enemy armor, place their shields for optimal mutual protection, and keep their formation even when the ground was covered in dead and blood. More significantly, they had created psychological strategies to keep discipline and morale high during protracted fighting. The Spartans recognized that ancient warfare involved both physical and mental combat. The ability of soldiers to remain resolute and confident during hours of intense fighting gave them a significant edge over adversaries who eventually grew weary, scared, or disappointed.
Ritual chants, continual reminders of slain colleagues who needed to be exacted revenge, and an honor system that recognized extraordinary valor in battle were all part of the Spartan strategy for boosting morale. Their realization that soldiers fight more effectively when they feel their colleagues are there for them no matter what, however, was possibly the most powerful. Every soldier knew he could always rely on the troops surrounding him because of the Spartan pledge to never desert a wounded friend, never flee without orders, and never concede defeat, no matter how dire the circumstances. On the battlefield, this mutual trust had significant real-world implications. Because they knew that their fellow soldiers would always be there for them, Spartan troops were able to take tactical chances that other armies would never consider. Because they knew other Spartans would take their places, they were able to continue attacking even after they were injured. They knew that their city and family would respect their sacrifice, so they could fight until the end. The contrast with their own military structure must have been stark and discouraging for the Persian soldiers confronting this formation at Thermopylae. Each of the many distinct nations that made up the Persian army had its own commanders, customs, and goals. This allowed the Persian army to be more specialized and flexible, but it also meant that soldiers frequently did not know the men they were fighting with. A Classite archer may be unsure if he can rely on an Egyptian spearman to defend his flank. If the battle went against them, a Median soldier might not be certain if his Persian allies would continue to fight. In high-stress combat scenarios, this lack of unity became a critical element. Persian soldiers could legitimately question whether it was worth fighting for causes other than their own with strangers in a conflict that seemed increasingly hopeless when they witnessed their forces suffering significant fatalities against the Spartan line. Such questions were simply unimaginable to the Spartans. They had been raised to believe that complete victory or a dignified death were the only acceptable outcomes. The psychological toll on Xerxes' troops was growing as the second day of the war at Thermopylae ended without any notable Persian advances. After marching into Greece with the assurance that they were superior in numbers and material might, soldiers were starting to question if they could win. There was a chance that commanders who had intended to be in Athens in a matter of days would be stuck in this pass for weeks. This scenario has significant strategic ramifications. The Persian strategy for conquering Greece relied on momentum. The Greeks used each day lost at Thermopylae as an opportunity to organize, assemble friends, and strengthen defensive positions in other parts of Greece. News would alter the outcome of the conflict arrived in this atmosphere. The Persians were to outflank the Spartan stronghold by following a mountain trail that a local Greek called Ephaltes had offered to show them. This knowledge provided Xerxes with just what he needed, a means of avoiding the natural stronghold that had enabled the few Greek defenders to be so successful. However, despite this tactical edge, the Persians would still have to deal with the underlying problem of how to deal with troops that just won't concede a fight.
They may be able to encircle the Spartans by using the mountain route, but surrounded soldiers who would sooner die than surrender do not necessarily become less threatening. They often become even more desperately effective. Leonidas,
The Spartan monarch in charge of the Greek army had to make a choice that would go against both the battle's result and the conventional wisdom of Spartan military prowess when he learned that the Persians had managed to outflank his position. He had two options. Either he stayed and fought to the end, knowing that such a sacrifice would have strategic and symbolic importance that could spur Greek resistance, or he tried to withdraw his men to fight another day, saving his skilled soldiers for future conflicts. Leonidas's choice is a superb example of what made the Spartans such psychologically adept soldiers across the Hellenistic world. In practically every other civilization, a sane military leader would want to keep skilled warriors alive for future battles. However, such a calculation was not possible under the Spartan value system. The Spartans felt that giving up when they were still able to fight was a basic betrayal of their values of bravery, honor, and duty. The majority of the Greek allies were expelled by Leonidas, enabling them to leave and fight in later conflicts. A few Theban and Thespian volunteers, however, decided to stay and die with him and his 300 Spartans. This was not a hasty or sentimental choice. It was a well-thought-out strategic decision founded on the knowledge that occasionally the symbolic importance of a final stand trumps the need to preserve military hardware. The third and last day of the war at Thermopylae served as a conclusive illustration of the Spartan military strategy's strengths and weaknesses. The remaining Spartans, outnumbered and surrounded by insurmountable odds, battled with a fierceness that even their adversaries were awed by. The final Spartans fought with swords, then daggers, and eventually fists and teeth, according to Persian sources, even after their spears were broken. There was more than just dramatic bravado in this final stand. It had significant impact on the larger Persian military operation in real-world ways. Despite being numerically sustainable, the Persians' severe losses at Thermopylae had a disproportionately negative effect on their troops' morale. Soldiers could no longer fully trust that the Persians were invincible after witnessing their best units destroyed by a few Greeks. More importantly, throughout the Hellenistic world, the Spartan sacrifice at Thermopylae became a powerful symbol that encouraged Greek resistance. City-states that had the option of submitting to the Persians amicably instead decided to resist, inspired by the example of the 300 who preferred death over surrender. This final stand had enormous propaganda significance for the Greek cause. Thermopylae, however, was only one front in a larger conflict, and we must examine the Spartans' larger military campaigns and their impact on the ancient world's power dynamics in order to fully see why they were so dreaded. Thermopylae proved to be a viable defensive strategy in the face of overwhelming odds. The Spartans, however, were equally adept at offensive warfare and could exert military might well beyond their own boundaries. Sparta became the leading military force in the Greek world in the decades after the Greco-Persian Wars. Its victory over Athens and its allies in the Peloponnesian War showed that its military might extended beyond dire defensive circumstances to the execution of intricate, multi-decade strategic battles.
Through a combination of superior discipline, tactical supremacy, and the psychological benefits their specially trained men offered, Spartan armies repeatedly demonstrated throughout the Peloponnesian War that they could beat numerically superior forces. The Spartans proved in wars as Mantinea that their superior phalanx formation and fighting discipline afforded them decisive advantages even against other seasoned Greek hoplites. The Spartans' capacity to uphold morale and discipline made them especially successful in prolonged combat.
Other Greek armies were made up mostly of citizen troops who had farms, businesses, or other civic duties to which they had to return, even during months-long or year-long battles. These troops were finally compelled to return home due to the economic and social strains caused by protracted operations. Such restrictions did not apply to the Spartans. They could stay in the field forever without facing financial pressure to return home because they were full-time professional soldiers who were paid by helots' labor. They possessed significant strategic advantages over their adversaries, who ultimately had to make a decision thanks to their capacity to maintain military operations for prolonged periods of time. They also have highly refined psychological warfare strategies to balance the demands of their civilian economies with the need to continue fighting. The Spartans recognized that defeating the enemy's will to resist was just as important as winning battles. They created specialized strategies to lessen their opponent's ability to bounce back from losses and increase the psychological impact of their wins. Their treatment of prisoners and conquered communities was one of these strategies. The Spartans frequently employed strategic displays of might to overcome resistance without needless combat. In contrast to many ancient armies that slaughtered or enslaved without distinction. While those that resisted suffered total destruction, those that promptly submitted were frequently treated with some leniency. Potential adversaries were strongly encouraged to give up rather than engage in combat. Mobile warfare was another skill that the Spartans mastered. They developed strategies for employing their heavy infantry in guerrilla operations, surprise attacks, and flanking maneuvers that maximized their advantages while restricting their enemy's ability to use numerical superiority. Even though their phalanx formation worked best in direct battle, they were especially dreaded for their midnight operations. In order to strike enemy camps with devastating surprise, the Spartans developed skills in quiet communication, lightless navigation, and coordinated attacks through prolonged training for fighting in the dark. After midnight, enemies could never be sure they were safe, which led to ongoing psychological stress that reduced morale and productivity. Additionally, Spartan military intelligence outperformed that of the majority of their peers. They were able to predict enemy moves and take advantage of political and military vulnerabilities in rival city-states by maintaining vast networks of spies and informants throughout the Greek world. They often gained significant strategic advantages before conflicts were ever fought. Their superior intelligence was almost above all a profound understanding of the ways in which politics, diplomacy, and military interacted.
They realized that achieving a long-term military triumph meant not just winning conflicts, but also establishing political frameworks that reduced the likelihood of future resistance. They carved their relationships with other city-states very carefully to maximize their military might and reduce the likelihood that friends might turn against them. The Spartans' response to Helot uprisings demonstrated this strategic sophistication. Instead of merely using physical force to put down uprisings, they often used force demonstrations, financial rewards, and political scheming to stop uprisings from gathering steam. When force was required, it was used in methods that were intended to deter future opposition without needlessly killing martyrs. The capacity of the Spartan military system to sustain dominance over the Peloponnese for more than 2 centuries demonstrates its long-term efficacy. No single city-state or group of city-states was able to successfully oppose Spartan military might during this time. Sparta maintained its basic military dominance even in the face of uprisings and invasions. This extended domination was a reflection of the ability of the entire Spartan system, military, political, economic, and social, to maintain military power on a regional level,
not just tactical superiority on the battlefield. In addition to having an excellent army, the Spartans had developed a whole culture that was well suited to deploying and sustaining military power. However, the Spartan system also contained built-in flaws that would ultimately lead to its downfall. They were unable to sustain high fatalities indefinitely due to their reliance on a comparatively small number of citizen soldiers. Every Spartan lost in combat symbolized years of preparation and financial commitment that were difficult to replace. Additionally, their social inflexibility hindered their capacity to adapt to evolving circumstances. When the Spartans encountered new kinds of warfare, the system that had made them so successful against conventional foes turned against them. Difficulties for which they lacked specialized training. This type of new threat was presented by the development of Macedonia under Philip II and Alexander the Great. After closely examining Spartan strategies, the Macedonians created unique military advances aimed at countering the country's long-standing advantages. Longer spears that could outrange Spartan spears were employed in their Macedonian phalanx configuration. The Spartan formation's deficiencies, which had not been an issue against earlier adversaries, could be exploited by their heavy cavalry. More significantly, while avoiding some of its drawbacks, the Macedonians had incorporated many of the best aspects of the Spartan military system. They recruited them from a far wider demographic base, yet they trained full-time professional troops like the Spartans. Like the Spartans, they placed a strong emphasis on discipline and unity, but they also retained tactical adaptability, which enabled them to adapt to many combat scenarios. The collapse of Spartan military power began in 371 BC with the Battle of Leuctra, in which a Theban army led by Epaminondas routed a Spartan force. This loss showed that while still strong, Spartan strategies were no longer unbeatable when opponents created specialized counter-strategies. However, despite its demise, the Spartan military heritage had a lasting impact on the evolution of warcraft in antiquity and beyond.
Effective armies throughout the ancient world adopted many of the Spartan innovations, including improved tactical coordination, unit discipline, psychological warfare, and professional military training. After studying Spartan tactics in great detail, the Romans, who would go on to conquer both Greece and the ancient Persian Empire, incorporated many aspects of the Spartan system into their own military structure. The Roman emphasis on discipline, uniform training, and unit loyalty is directly responsible for the Spartan influence. The Spartans are still studied by modern military professionals, not only for historical reasons, but also because many of the core principles that made them so successful, such as the value of intense training, cohesive units, capable leadership, and psychological readiness for battle, remain applicable to modern military operations. In addition to being incredibly skilled warriors, the Spartans also showed how a small society could attain and sustain military superiority over much larger adversaries through intense specialization, tactical innovation, and a complete dedication to military excellence. This is what makes the Spartan military history so remarkable. They demonstrated that when built methodically and scientifically, quality may prevail over quantity in a conflict. The lesson was clear to the Persian soldiers who encountered Spartans at locations such as Thermopylae. They were up against the result of a whole social structure devoted to producing the best fighters, not just talented individual soldiers. Nowhere else in the ancient world could they compare to the decades of specialized training, genetic selection, psychological conditioning, and tactical preparedness that each Spartan they encountered represented. This was the real reason why the Spartans made their foes fearful. It wasn't only that killing them was hard. Many soldiers in antiquity were courageous and tenacious. They were more than just well-trained. Experienced warriors were also present in other armies.
Persian soldiers saw not only foes to be vanquished, but also the result of one of the most extreme military social engineering experiments the world has ever seen. The Spartan warriors were waiting in perfect order. The total devotion of a whole community to the art of war was symbolized by each of those golden warriors. And in the end, this is what made dealing with the Spartans so terrifying. Because they demonstrated that society's willingness to forego all else in the name of military perfection was more important in a conflict than individual bravery or even numerical dominance. This decision had been fully taken by the Spartans, and its effects had been seen for generations on ancient battlefields. Even the greatest empires and the most disciplined warriors in human history were ultimately mortal in the face of the larger forces that determine a nation's fate, as we must acknowledge when considering this remarkable military history. In his providence, the Lord God permitted empires to grow and fall, civilizations to flourish and decline, and even the most arrogant warriors to discover their limitations. Although human training, discipline, and bravery can achieve remarkable heights, the Spartan myth serves as a reminder that a greater power always decides how human events ultimately unfold. Like all of history, their triumphs and setbacks were a part of a bigger scheme that is beyond our comprehension and serves as a reminder of the need for humility in the face of the divine magnificence that controls all human affairs.